Siri and Earth Science recording in progress. Today, Siri and Earth Sciences are joining together to co-host Dr. Davia Downey's colloquium. Her colloquium will be about disasters and economic recovery. Dr. Downey joined SUAP, the School of Urban Affairs and Public Policies, here at the University of Memphis in August. Director of the PhD in Urban Studies. Dr. Downey earned her doctoral degree from Michigan State University, where she explored race, class, and Hurricane Katrina. Her research interests focus at the intersection of disaster, emergency management, and policy. Urban policy making at the local, state, and federal scales is a topic of her expertise and interest. Dr. Downey, welcome to campus. Take it away.
Okay, so I am going to be presenting one chapter from the book that was just recently published earlier this year called Disasters and Economic Recovery. In the book itself, I'll be talking about that a little bit later, but my dissertation was around Hurricane Katrina, and over time I've done some other studies on disaster and economic recovery and sort of trying to think about whether or not there is a link. I think that there is, and I think most of the time when we talk about disasters and how places recover, economics and the availability of jobs, where they are, who has them, is something that is part of the media discourse. It's part of analytical importance, and it's really fundamentally important for the places that are impacted by natural disasters. So that's kind of my lens. My degree, as Dr. Hill said, is in political science. So I'm also really interested in some of the policy discourse that surrounds how we develop policies, particularly around natural disasters, because as we'll see as I get sort of started here, we don't do a great job with planning for something that we don't know is going to happen, when it's going to happen, and how much it's going to cost. And so all of these factors really limit policymakers in their ability to forecast exactly how much something's going to cost, how detrimental it's going to be to the local economy, and also how long it's going to take to return to normalcy. You'll hear me say normalcy a lot in this presentation, and I put normalcy in quotes because in reality, disasters never end. Places are permanently sort of transformed by what has happened there. And so while policymakers and people involved in the emergency management and economic development spheres are thinking about these kinds of things, they do recognize that natural disasters or unnatural disasters in some cases do impact the landscape permanently, both socially, economically, politically, and so on. So I'm going to talk about my book. All right, so let's get started here. So just to kind of give us a little bit of context about how we typically look at emergency management, not necessarily in the United States, but sort of around the world. So FEMA utilizes a 4-phase of emergency management, although sometimes they add a 5th phase, which is the prevention strategies that you see here on the right. In the mitigation phase, this is usually thinking about ways that we can mitigate or reduce the likelihood that that a disaster is going to impact the normal sort of pathway of events. So mitigation strategies can include things like, ensuring that we have good floodplain management, ensuring that we have good construction codes, et cetera, et cetera. So sort of trying to make sure that we sort of retrofit the urban landscape so that it is much more resilient in the face of some sort of hazard. Preparedness has to do with practicing, right? So sort of thinking to ourselves, now that we've had all of these mitigation efforts that may cover building construction and floodplain management and sort of structural things, how prepared are citizens to know what they need to do when a disaster strikes? So if we have a fire, if we have an earthquake, if we have a flood, if we have a hurricane, if we have a tsunami or a tornado, all of those are different kinds of hazards, and they actually need citizens to realize and recognize that they need to be prepared for all of those different kinds of hazards. Then we move into the response phase, and that's actually after a disaster hits. After a disaster hits, we have national, local, regional, sometimes international authorities that come in to assist with evacuation, with taking out debris. All of those kinds of things sort of happen in that phase. And then we have the recovery phase. And the recovery phase is really about rebuilding, thinking about what happened, looking backwards to what worked well, what did not work so well, and how we can be prepared to prevent a future cataclysmic disaster or event in the future. So these things are really important to kind of understand, because it's not just localities that are doing these kinds of things. These kinds of plans happen at the state level, they happen at the regional level, and they happen at the national level. And there's a communication component of emergency management planning between government and citizens, so that they know what is going to happen in each of these phases. So this is important to just kind of understand the framing of emergency management in general. So when this is a picture on the left-hand side of Hurricane Katrina. So these were images that I think we might have forgotten now that we are kind of 12, 13 years away from Hurricane Katrina, but we might have forgotten exactly how detrimental and devastating it looked. Hurricane Katrina put the city of New Orleans underwater for about 70 days. Power did not come back to the French Quarter and the Central Business District for about 30 to 45 days. So when we talk about natural disasters, there is social disruption, there's spatial disruption, and obviously there's going to be some economic disruption, because you have to move people out, you have to clean things up, you have to recover what can be recovered, and then you have to make a plan for how do we bring people back and provide jobs for them so that they want to stay and return. So these are the level and scale of disasters always will have a social, spatial, and economic component. So just to kind of give a little bit of background on my book and background on sort of my perspective, and I'm kind of weaving in a few different threads. So, in my research, in my sort of exploration of the research, most natural disasters focus on issues of resilience, policy development, post-disaster, sort of looking backwards to see what worked and what didn't, and then sort of planning forward. Some research on natural disasters has looked at vulnerable populations and those impacts cross-nationally, internationally, and also locally. Sometimes researchers have looked at the impact of large-scale relief programs and their effectiveness. So we've had a ton of studies about FEMA and how well those programs, individual assistance, and other programs that they utilize to sort of help homeowners and business owners to recover their losses during a disaster work. There's also another sort of frame of research that looks at issues of intergovernmental coordination, right? So as I've already explained, these kinds of disasters might hit a place locally, but many cities and many places that are hit by natural disasters also have an importance to state and or national economic viability, right? So when New Orleans was underwater for almost 70 days, we had a major port that was shut down. We had the same thing happen when we had Hurricane Harvey come through Houston, right? So there is some aspect of natural disaster and emergency management planning that requires different levels of government to coordinate together, right? And so scholars have identified issues of a lack of coordination. Who's on first is sort of what we hear after natural disasters happen, who's supposed to be acting, and that can often create bottlenecks in terms of facilitating the recovery quickly. Other scholars have also looked at wide variation of the impact of natural disaster on the socioeconomic status of individuals, right? So not all places are the same. Every single place that is impacted by a natural disaster is going to have a wide variation of people that are impoverished, people that might be racial minorities, people that might be religious or ethnic minorities. And those kinds of things coming from the political science literature tell us that when we think about policy making, who is in the room dictates what actually happens to the recovery process. So I'll give you a little bit of an example of something like that happened in the city of New Orleans. So that's some of the literature that I looked at to sort of come up with the theory. So talking about the plan of the book. So the biggest problem that I've seen, and something that I've been interested in researching for the last 10 or 15 years, is the issues of collaboration and coordination. time and time and time and time and time again, whenever there is a natural disaster, there is always this discussion of the efficacy of FEMA. Some people point to the fact that FEMA was moved under the Department of Homeland Security post 9/11 as a problem. Some people think that FEMA, in terms of its charge and the way that they have to interact with lots of governmental and non-governmental actors to facilitate recovery, is problematic. Sometimes people point at the problems of federalism, right? That we have multiple different units of government that actually have to collaborate, and these collaborations are usually short-term, and we don't know when they're going to happen, right? We never know when a disaster is going to strike. So all of a sudden, if different areas of the country or different levels of government need to interact with each other, and they don't normally do that, this can also be problematic. Most emergency management studies that I have looked at have focused on the immediate aftermath of disasters. What happened right away, right? As opposed to long-term economic and policy impacts. That's the thing that's most important to me, because if we rebuild and the buildings are nice and we see some population return, what happens next, right? How do local leaders, how do state leaders, regional leaders sort of think about incentivization so that we can attract businesses, so that we can retain businesses, and so that we can return people that might have been displaced by a disaster back home with a job that will help them to stay, right? So if we talk about recovery, we think about recovery of buildings, we're missing the point. If we think about the recovery of economics, meaning the people that were impacted by these disasters, and making sure that the firms and businesses and jobs are available for them to return to, is more of a long-term component of emergency management policy that's really underplayed, in my opinion. And it's also usually a local government activity in the United States. So we'll see a little bit later, the chapter that I'm going to talk about is an international case that I used, and that's not the story in other countries. But in the United States, economic development policy largely is under the control of localities. And so all of those issues of social inequities, existing issues of race and poverty might actually limit the ability of communities to recover in ways that we would expect, especially when you consider the amount of federal injection of funds, state injections of funds that might be coming to an area to help them recover. And that's that social stratification component. So why is this important? First and foremost, there really are no clear metrics on this. How do we know when a place has recovered? Is it when we open up the French Quarter for business? Is it when Wall Street rings the bell 2 or 3 weeks later after a big, huge hurricane hits the financial district of New York? Is it when we've eliminated all the debris from the streets? There really is no national, local, or international standards on what we think of as recovered, right? So I personally think that we need to be looking a lot further out to really think about the economic consequences of all of that activity that happens in the immediate recovery stage. In my sort of search of the literature, there's not a whole lot of studies that are connecting these economic changes post-disaster as a guide, right? As a guideline. We sort of say, New Orleans is back, or New York is open for business, or New Jersey can welcome you to the Jersey Shore again, right? We sort of like say these things, but then we don't actually know what that looks like. So I really wanted to think about that a lot more closely. And then the other thing is thinking about how different sector levels, sectors of the economy change. So when I talk about sectors of the economy here, what I mean to say is, where are jobs going? Are they going mostly into construction, which we know in the recovery phase are likely going to be short term? Are they going into service sectors, meaning, wait staff, restaurants, business, tourism? Are they going into finance? Where are they going? So even though we might say that a community is recovered because the lights are on and people are going to work, where are those jobs at? Very few studies really think about where those jobs are and what that looks like. So that was sort of an opportunity to insert myself into the literature and provide some information about what happens. So some other things that I want to say just a little bit about economic development more specifically. First, economic development studies typically don't think about natural disasters. We always are thinking about incentivization in the United States, the use of tax increment financing, and their impact on the local economy. economic development post-disaster, what I have found is nonlinear because we have fits and starts of setbacks and push forwards. We have, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for those economic incentives to actually kick in. And so while we have these issues of relief, the direct rescue relief processes that happen in the recovery phase, then we have this rehabilitation phase where we have this temporary settlement, temporary resettlement, repair of those damaged buildings. Then there's this transition phase, and we don't know how long that is. We just sort of, somebody will say, oh, okay, we're done here, and now there's another disaster that we need to pay attention to. So that transition phase between rehabilitation and recovery is kind of an unknown factor. But when we talk about recovery, we're talking about a couple of things here. We're talking about the amount of people who come back after disaster. We're talking about the quality and quantity of community redevelopment. We're talking about the quantity and quality of community renewal. We're talking about those the implementation of things that we learned. How do we mitigate? How do we recover better the next time? And then we have a lot of people talking about this return to normalcy. I question what normalcy is in this particular case. And then we look at local, state, regional capacity. What is the capacity of these different governmental agencies that are working in the recovery phase? So these are all of these kinds of things that are occurring. When we look at the nice little flow chart, it sort of seems like it should be seamless, that it should happen fairly quickly. But depending on the scale and the scope of a disaster, that may not always be true. So I'm going to tell you a little vignette. So as I said before, national, local, state actors work together in the United States to address natural disasters when they occur. In the city of New Orleans, after Hurricane Katrina, there was a plan that was developed by the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, and it was also sort of facilitated by the Urban Land Institute. And if this is going back about a decade or so, so some of you that are not all that familiar with Hurricane Katrina, the big thing that came out of the BNOBC was the green dot map. So you see sort of some of this green dot map. So what I want you to understand is that these green dots, these sort of green areas, are places that people lived. So if you remember that picture that I showed you at the very beginning of my talk, one of the big green dots is actually right over here. This is the story of Broadmoor. And one of the things that the Bring New Orleans Back Commission did is they made a requirement in their redevelopment plan to have residents of a neighborhood that might have been underwater be significantly returned in order to prevent future parkland to be developed on those spaces. So what this basically means, I'll translate that a little bit more. So many communities, especially in the bowl of New Orleans, were underwater. And so when the Bring New Orleans Commission came together, they had a plan for redevelopment. And what they basically said was, if we look at these different neighborhoods that have been underwater, and we sort of say that after a certain period of time, if a certain percentage of the population hasn't returned, that we can basically make this parkland. It shows that these neighbors or these neighborhoods, these citizens that lived in these areas, are not able to come back. They don't want to come back. And so that gives the city sort of free range to make these spaces what we want. And so in Broadmoor, this is a really highly impoverished area in the city of New Orleans. It's next to the lower Ninth Ward. It's next to the lower Ninth Ward, and they didn't have a whole lot of citizens that could return because it was one of the last places in the city of New Orleans that got power and got recovery efforts sort of directed towards them. And so they had a returning population problem. And so this is a really great example of top-down versus bottom-up planning. So while the Bring New Orleans Back Commission really wanted to have community input, they sort of capitulated that on the fact that if a neighborhood didn't have enough returning population, that meant that they weren't able to plan. They weren't able to plan for their own neighborhood. And so there was a tremendous amount of pushback once the green dot map was made public. This actually comes from the local newspaper in New Orleans. And once people got word of this, people that were dispersed from Broadmoor came back to develop a community neighborhood plan and said, hey, BNCO, Bring New Orleans Back Commission, we are here. We do not want our neighborhood to be parkland. Don't do that to us. And so this is really something that's very interesting that happens primarily in local governments that we don't think of. We don't think about this when we talk about recovery. We don't think about local governments making decisions about what is supposed to be happening with land that might not necessarily look from the naked eye as a place that needs to have directed reinvestment. And so this is a cautionary tale of the limits of how economic development can proceed after a natural disaster hits. So what happened after Hurricane Katrina? So some of the other things that we need to know is that while we heard a lot of discussion by then President George Bush and the governor the governor at the time, and then Mayor Ray Nagin, what we see is that after Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2005, that there have been some structural, social, economic changes in the city. So we see that from the year 2000 through the year 2010, we've had a tremendous amount of population loss from the previous census, although that has come back somewhat. So you can see this difference here. One other thing that's happened that I think is really interesting, especially if we consider the economic development impacts of policies that were made after Hurricane Katrina, is that unemployment has actually gone up in the city of New Orleans as of about 6 or 7 years ago. I don't have the current figures on that, so but I can get them, and I don't think that they've moved all that much from the last time that I checked. One of the other things that we see as well is that the African American population in the city has changed. And that story about Broadmoor is a perfect example of how, when we don't have the right voices in the room, and I use the word right, that's sort of a normative statement, when we don't have the citizens themselves in the process of planning for recovery, that means that they don't have a place in the new city that's being developed. And what we can see here is that over time, in the last 15 years or so, 15, 20 years or so, the city of New Orleans has become less African American over time. Some people think that that's okay, but I would think that the residents that have been permanently displaced from Hurricane Katrina would probably say the opposite of that. In addition, we also see some tremendous issues with home ownership. As we started to develop economic development plans in the city of New Orleans, and we had all of this sort of influx of new people, new places, new things, a lot of gentrification happening at the neighborhood level, we also see that the city of New Orleans has become really unaffordable to live in. And so this does change the social, the economic, and the spatial landscape in ways that, when we talk about recovery, my question and the thing that I would pose to you is to say, recovery for whom? That's the big thing that we need to kind of get at here. Recovery for whom? All right, so some other things to note here. So let's talk a little bit about theory. So there's a couple of pieces here, and I'll kind of get through these pretty quickly. Political competition, government decision-making is all about who gets what and when, right? So if we don't allow for people to participate, if we don't sort of create local strategies to involve the local community, policy is not going to look like the people who need it. There is also significant mobilization of bias into political decision-making, particularly around economic development policy. Economic development policies tend to try to attract new businesses to communities, and sometimes the kinds of businesses that local leaders might want are not the kinds of things that local residents may need. And so there's a bias here to sort of focus on big firm development or, new shiny tech firms that might not necessarily match with the socioeconomic or educational background of our current residents. There's tremendous funding constraints in the United States due to federalism. We have to balance budgets. We have some limits on bonds. We have limits on how much money we can raise, how much money we can spend, and also how much we can incentivize using, the credit rating of our locality to get bond funding to pay for tax increment financing or something like that. Obviously, in natural disasters, especially significant ones like Hurricane Katrina or Sandy, or any other disasters that have happened recently, natural disasters produce an intense administrative load, right? And in the federal system of government, this is even more complicated, right? So federalism means that you have lots of different units of government that have to collaborate and coordinate, and that makes it very difficult to make any kind of decision quickly. There are some issues in the literature about business incentivization. We do this a lot in the United States. In the case that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, we do business incentivization in the United States in a very different way than other places across the world. Is what I will say for that. We also have issues of globalization, right? So we have these other pressures in the economic sphere. The United States needs to be competitive. If we have these cities that are sort of impacted by natural disasters, New York, New Orleans, that are sort of tied to the global economy, this is also providing an additional pressure to jumpstart, to restart the economy quickly, and to ensure that our community doesn't get disconnected from the benefits of globalization. And then, as I said before, social stratification does matter because it matters to how local governments decide to engage with the community or not when they are developing these plans. So the theory that I develop and I expand upon in the book is basically that economic development post-disaster in highly centralized governments, because I have two cases that are unitary governments and two cases that are federal systems. So I compare the policy development that occurs in all of these different cases, and I hypothesize that centralized governments that centralize the economic development planning process, will actually be more aimed at collaboration and resilience. And it's expected that these economic development incentives in centralized companies or centralized countries, are going to be focused on strengthening local economies and providing redistribution amongst current residents and newcomers. All right, so that's the biggest thing that I think will be the differential, is government and governmental fragmentation actually impacts our ability to plan well in the economic development post-disaster period. So let's talk about the different types of economic incentivization. So for those of you guys that study earthquakes and for those of you guys that study sort of natural hazards, this may be new to you, but there is a wide range of things that local governments do to target investment. And so one of the things that I did while I was doing this book was I pulled every single economic development plan at the local, state, regional, or national level that was aimed at recovering and the cases, the cities, the areas in the book. And so some of these economic development strategies are seen as progressive, meaning that they are targeting workforce development. They might be promoting worker training. They might be creating linkage programs between, certain areas of the central business district. They also might ensure performance guarantees, saying like, we will give you these kinds of funds, but you have to perform at this level or else we will retract that funding. Some cities choose to use infrastructure-based economic incentivization. So sometimes we might use money to improve public services or infrastructure. We might do cultural investment with some of those dollars. We might do streetscape improvements. But these are all sort of ways of sort of making downtown or central business districts pretty, right? So that might attract investment, that might attract workers, that might create more of an environment of productivity. Some economic incentivization strategies are focused on land development, meaning, how can we take a plot of land and assemble it so that it's connected to public water, electricity, those kinds of things. Some cities focus on business relocation, and the case that I'm going to talk about actually has that as a policy initiative after the earthquakes in New Zealand. Some cities manage property directly, some facilitate building rehab, some cities develop industrial parks. Some countries, some cities, some states use direct tax policies to incentivize businesses to locate here. I know that most of you guys have heard about the Ford plant being moved. That's a very good example of a direct tax policy, giving a tax break to a major corporation to move their stuff to your town. And then we have business assistance, and we also have marketing assistance. So just to kind of recapitulate this, what I did is I looked at all of the policies that were developed post-disaster in all of the cases that I looked at. I'm going to talk about the cases in just a second. And I essentially just coded 0 or 1 whether or not these kinds of activities were present. So I created an additive index. So we had a range of scores from like 0 to about 25. So you see each of these different categories. We read all of the policies and we said, okay, this is a policy that is targeted towards workforce development. That gets coded 1. And so we basically added them across all of the different cases in the book. One other thing that I want to also reinforce here is that I also believe that government design matters here. When we talk about federalism and the complications of interactions between federal, state, and local governments in the United States, almost all of the time that we talk about what FEMA does and what state and local governments are doing during a natural disaster is a story about disconnection, not collaborative, lots of arguing back and forth across different levels. This makes it much more difficult to create policies that are aimed at economic development or even aimed at recovering a local government, right? In unitary countries, typically it's the central government that takes the lead, and so there's downward communication that sort of it comes in one voice essentially, and so they delegate downwards, but it's the central government that's sort of taking the lead in terms of dictating how economic development is going to proceed. And so the case that I'm talking about today is a unitary country, the New Zealand, and I'll talk exactly about how they worked from the national level downward to create these economic plans post-disaster. So in the book, I cover 5 cases. I look at Hurricane Katrina. I look at New Jersey and New York after Hurricane Sandy. I look at the Christchurch, New Zealand earthquake. And I look at the triple disaster, which was actually a nuclear disaster, a tsunami, and an earthquake that happened in the Tohoku region in Japan. I'm only going to be able to talk about one today, but I encourage you to read the book if you want to find out what I found for the other cases. I took a longitudinal cross-sectional design. So I wanted to look at job development trends in these places prior to natural disasters and after natural disasters, thinking about the outcome variable of those different kinds of economic development incentives that might have been employed in the post-disaster period to facilitate new job development. So the main variables of interest that I looked at was the amount, so that index variable of economic incentivization that was produced post-disaster, the number of new jobs that were attained or created in that post-disaster period, and then I look at issues of race, ethnicity, poverty, and ageism. Japan is actually a fairly non-diverse country in the sense that they don't have a lot of racial minorities, but they had a tremendous amount of older people that lived in the Tohoku region, and that actually was a really big consideration in their planning afterwards. And then also thinking about how all of these features of the social economic differentiation across cases impacted policy dynamics. So essentially we have form of government, coordination, we have social and economic conditions, and then we have economic development incentivization, and then the magnitude of disaster actually matters, right? So how big the scale matters to how much these economic incentives are going to be utilized. So as I said before, I collected 5 years of data pre-post disaster for all of the variables of interest. I collected all the policies, and I looked at all of these policies along with the graduate assistant to sort of code them to see whether or not these incentives were present or not. I also wanted to make sure that I provided a comparison between the directly affected areas to the unaffected areas. So I was able to analyze this using a panel regression technique, which essentially sort of takes snapshots of each of these areas over time. And then I also utilize interrupted time series analysis as a second check to look at the impact of the disaster on new hiring activity. And I define new hiring as all employees that are in newly created jobs who were not employed by the same employer in the previous quarter. So we annualize that for comparability, and this really is showing that we have lots of different kinds of choices that we can use in terms of looking at hiring. I was really interested in thinking about what kinds of jobs are created by these economic incentives and how many new jobs officially were being created by these policy changes. As I said here, this is just a nice table so you can kind of see percentage of minority residents, percentage under poverty, high school graduates, college or university graduates, percentage of unemployed. For some reason, minority residents shows up there twice. Sorry, guys. And then disaster funds committed, economic strategies that were employed post-disaster. And then I have a dummy variable for the disaster year. And all of these, while all of this data, in some cases, was available quarterly in order to have comparability across the country cases. I annualized this data. So I collected every single quarter, and then I averaged those quarters so that we could get an average over time so that we could compare. I can talk a little bit more about the differences in census collection in New Zealand and Japan because that actually became more of a problem as I started to explore that data. All right, so I've already talked about that. I can talk more about methodology. There's a lot of methods in this book. Pooled ordinary least squares, structural equation modeling I had to use in some cases because there were some missing data issues. So I use SEM and multiple imputation. If anybody has questions about why I chose to use that, I can talk about that. And then the panel regression analysis. And then I also use interrupted time series to sort of look at the effect against the affected and unaffected categories, or unaffected parishes or unaffected areas. So hypotheses, just to kind of cover these really quickly, I think that the amount of social stratification is going to negatively impact the creation of new jobs. I think that poverty is going to also negatively impact the use of economic incentives. I can detail a little bit more why that has been sort of consistently found in the literature if people have questions about that. I also think that the number of residents under the poverty line also impacts negatively a new job creation post-disaster. I also think, conversely, this is sort of from the economic development literature, that the higher the median income of residents, the less likely a government is going to use economic incentives. So in a country like New Zealand, which is actually the one that I'm going to be talking about in just a second, is actually a fairly rich country. They didn't use a ton of economic incentives, which might be a little bit contrafactual to what we would expect after a natural disaster, but they also have a very large social safety net. So they have a higher median income, they have a large social safety net, and there's some more details that actually made it a lot less likely for them to need to use economic incentives in the post-disaster context because people were relatively okay. Also, education matters to economic development. Obviously, to attract a new firm or to retain firms, you need to have an educated workforce. So that was also something that was really important. And I actually don't really think that the impact of external investment, meaning disaster funds that are committed to an area to recover it, have any impact on economic development policy development. All right, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit to Christchurch. So let's talk about this. So Christchurch, New Zealand, if you've watched The Lord of the Rings, you know what we're talking about. That is the Canterbury region. That is the place that was impacted by a series of earthquakes from late 2010 through 2011. Canterbury, the region itself, so it's made up of 13 different areas. I hesitate to call them states. We call them regional territories in New Zealand, but there's 13 regional territories in Canterbury. Christchurch is one of those regional territories. This area of the country makes up about 9% of the national GDP, and it's mostly home to agriculture, mountains, and tourism. So again, one of the reasons why you saw all of it in The Lord of the Rings is because it's a really pretty place. All right, so some other things to know about New Zealand is that it is home to a significant proportion of Maori residents. This, and I don't want to talk a ton about this, it's in the book, so I really encourage you guys to buy it if you want to know more about this, but they have some complications in terms of what we would talk about race relations in the United States. And most of this has to do with land and sovereignty, of retaining sovereignty for the Maori people as opposed to the white settlers that came in to settle the country. Okay, so some things to kind of fast forward here. So some other things to understand about New Zealand is 85% of the total population lives in just 4 cities in the entire country. This is very different than the United States. So when we think about the kind of population concentration, this also means that it's easier for the central government to guide economic development. So local governments in the country of New Zealand are really limited in what they can do. They can levy taxes to fund local services, but there's significant oversight, especially if a local government or regional territory or regional council or territory council wants to borrow money to fund something. So they have very strict guidelines on how much local governments can borrow to facilitate economic development. That is mostly guided by the central government. So there's very little incentivization for local economic activity because these 4 cities basically generate all of the economic activity. So local governments are sort of not really in the game of creating local economic incentives. So when these disaster strikes, just to kind of give you some context on what happened here, we had 32 days of national air quality that was really damaging. There was widespread damage to the land. There was a lot of liquefaction, meaning that the land essentially sort of settled and spread out. About 90% of Greater Christchurch, the city that's located in Canterbury, was damaged. $29 billion worth of damage, insurance losses was sort of recognized by the government, and Christchurch lost about 3% of their population due to uninhabitable homes because of that liquefaction. The country of New Zealand also instituted a government-sanctioned buyout program, and that facilitated some population loss after the disaster. So a couple of things about the main actors that were developing policy post-disaster. So we had the Christchurch City Council, we had the Christchurch Earthquake Royal Commission, and we had the National Crisis Management Center, which is akin to FEMA in the country. So we had we had sort of a local/regional, and then we had the national that were working together. In terms of identifying where we needed to recover, the country worked really quickly to identify red zones, and they said, nobody can move back here. These are lands that should be off limits because they're not safe, and we cannot actually retrofit these buildings or rebuild them in ways that will sustain another kind of earthquake like this. The areas that you see in yellow were essentially said we can do some rebuilding, and that's going to be returnable with some rehabilitation. And these new policies also required for these new buildings to have much more concrete, enhanced foundations to combat that liquefaction that occurs in the earthquakes. So, a couple of things about economic development policy responses. So, 2 things to note here. One thing that really significantly changed the trajectory of how economic development proceeded after the earthquakes in Canterbury and in Christchurch more specifically was the fact that every single person in the country of New Zealand is covered by earthquake disaster insurance. This is a public corporation that also pools together private coverage. So every single household, regardless of if you're a renter or an owner, has coverage against any kind of disaster. So they pull together these public funds and they distribute it to individuals that are living on land. So it's connected to land and home. So if you had a farm, you got money. If you had a home and a farm, you got money. If you had just a home, you got money. And it was all facilitated through the central government. This is much, 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 much more of a cleaner distribution of funds back to affected people than we see in the United States. Canterbury also created its own earthquake recovery fund, and they managed most of the recovery and response efforts. And then we also had the LAP program, and that was also there to facilitate, there's a 60-40 share. So local governments in Canterbury and in New Zealand more broadly are able to kind of create a pooled fund so that they can pay their share when a natural disaster strikes. So the central government invested about $2.5 million into Business Recovery Trust Fund. They also created a business mentoring program to facilitate businesses that wanted to do some export marketing post-disaster. They also created a grant program to help local businesses with those export needs. Local government subsidized wage assistance for affected businesses. I have never heard of a local government in the United States doing wage assistance post-disaster. Not one. They also opened up a community and collaborative program planning process that was called the Share an Idea program. So it really allowed for every single resident that was in Christchurch to submit an idea about what they wanted the city to look like post-disaster. So instead of connecting it to returning residents or something like that, they said everybody can submit an idea, we'll collate them, and then we'll present the idea to the community, and then we will think about what the plan needs to look like going forward, right? So sort of this iterative planning process. So just kind of looking a little bit about some effects. People like to see numbers, so I'll show you some numbers. So this is looking at the unaffected and the affected area. So Canterbury as a region versus Christchurch as a locale. This looks at the different number of new hires and ascensions, post-disasters. This is just the mean average over 5 years. This looks at the number of new hires. This was logged because of there was a difference between Christchurch as the city and then Canterbury as a region. Christchurch has most of the population. The region has very little population, so I needed to log that so that it could be comparable. Looking at differences in ethnicity, deprivation index is basically New Zealand's way of measuring poverty. So in this particular chapter, I looked at deprivation and as opposed to a poverty line measure. I looked at the difference of a bachelor's degree holders, master's degree holders, and then post-baccalaureate degree holders as well. We looked at turnover rate, job turnover rate, and we looked at the unemployment rate. And this is sort of averaged over the entire period. Just some pairwise correlations. Most of the variables are fairly highly correlated with each other. So that's just something to kind of know and to kind of keep in the back of your mind as I proceed through the next couple of slides. So moving into the actual results. So here I said again, looking at the number of new jobs that were developed. New Zealand calls them accessions. So in the American chapters, I call them new hires, but in New Zealand, they call these accessions, these new jobs that were not present in the economy prior to. I also looked at the difference between the Maori population to the overall population. I looked at that deprivation index, and I looked at education, turnover, unemployment rate, and this is what we basically see here. So we see that the higher deprivation, the lower, that deprivation actually impacts the creation and use of economic incentives, post-disaster, and basically nothing else in the pooled OLS. So I moved over to a structural equation model because the New Zealand data, they have some gaps in their data, and that finding stayed consistent between those two. So here what we see is that there is a significant portion of Maori that live in this area of the country. And deprivation is actually something that was a focus of all of the economic development discussions. How do we bring the Maori in line with this economic recovery? And so what we see here is that we used a lot more economic development incentives in order to impact new job accessions. So that's kind of a way of interpreting that. Looking at the interrupted time series analysis, we see the year, I used 2010 because that was the time that the earthquake started. We see a significant drop in the number of accessions, the number of new jobs that are developed, but post-intervention, we see that linear association goes up. And that is actually really encouraging. It sort of shows the impact of those economic incentivization strategies that were utilized in the Canterbury region. In the second slide, or the second half of the slide, you'll see the Christchurch in black and the rest of the region in gray. So even though we have Canterbury as a region, Christchurch is one location, one territory inside the Canterbury area. So I compared new job accessions pre and post disaster between those two areas of the entire region. And so what we see here is that economic incentivization really focused more tightly in Christchurch, even though the earthquakes did impact some of the hinterlands around Christchurch. Those economic incentives were direct, and they were directly impacted the city, not the rest of the region. And so from an economic development standpoint, that's actually a good thing. It's showing that the strategies that were utilized by the central government, the regional governments, and the local governments were targeted in such a way that it produced the effect that they wanted, which is new ascensions, new jobs going up after the disaster in a sort of linear fashion. We don't expect to see the same kind of economic development incentivization affecting outside Christchurch because the way that those incentives were designed was only for businesses that were affected in the central business district. Some cautionary things, though, to know is that I also looked at wages over time, and I know that the slide is small, but what we'll see here is that despite the fact that we had a lot of new hiring, that wages between the Maori and other ethnic groups, and so all ethnic groups is basically just all of the whites coming from different countries. So the way that the census works in New Zealand is if you're Scottish, if you're British, if you're Australian, they consider those ethnicities. So that's what we mean when that's what this means when you see all ethnic groups. We still have some significant issues in terms of average earnings between the Maori and all ethnic groups. So even though they were considered, and economic development incentivization really considered bringing the Maori sort of up in terms of their economic situations, we have closed the gap, but it still remains fairly significantly wide. So I think that brings me to the end. I covered a lot. I know, but if I'll open it up for questions, I think we have like 5-10 more minutes left. So I'm happy to answer anything that you guys would like to ask me.
Hi.
Well,
Oh, it's Gary. You want to go first? Sorry.
go right ahead, Christos.
Okay. Hi. Thank you. Hi, Davia. Thank you for your presentation. I'm Christos Kyriakopoulos, and I'm originally from Greece. I will actually send you an email about a successful case of recovery from a Greek city in the 80s.
Awesome.
It's a different story. I have just a very general question because I have many questions, but cannot ask many questions. So,
Right.
how much you think the economic system that you have in the United States against the average social democracy that we have in Europe make a difference in our recovery, and keeping also into account, yes, that we see Katrina, which it was a big event, but me being a earthquake scientist, I'm looking towards the next big one near Los Angeles. So how much the economic system, right? I will call it, I don't know, dogmatic capitalism or whatever you want to call it, but it's not social
Neoliberalism is what we
democracy.
usually say. Yes, neoliberalism.
Okay.
Personally, I think that this is a large problem in the United States. So I talked about it really briefly, and again, the book talks a lot more in terms of the social safety nets that were present in Japan and New Zealand. So one of the biggest things that I really wanted to show here is that government design also really matters, right? So there's two things that are at play. First, a federal system sort of delegates powers to different levels of government, right? So different levels of government don't necessarily need to talk to each other unless there's some sort of constitutional question, right? So local governments are largely left to design whatever they want in the United States. In addition to that, we have a very ineffective social safety net, right? So when we talk about individual assistance as it's done through FEMA, right, individual assistance is typically given to homeowners. There's not a whole lot of renter assistance that is designed within FEMA. And this is always constantly sort of brought up, like we need to make sure that we equalize this because we have a large number of renters that were in New Orleans. We had a large number of renters that were actually in New York and New Jersey as well, which is something that I find. And so with the lack of a national program that provides insurance, right? We do have a national flood insurance program, consistently underfunded. They always have to put injections into the NFIP in the United States because they underfund it all the time. So unlike in Japan and New Zealand, we don't have the assurances that the federal, state, or local government is going to be able to provide insurance coverage for our losses. And then we also have to wait for FEMA to analyze an area individually for each different house and then decide how much money they're going to give us, right? In Japan and in New Zealand, it's a lot more straightforward. Everybody's covered. Everybody gets an amount based on what the previous value of that home was, and that goes so much further in terms of thinking about how stable an individual can be and how likely an individual might feel about going back home. So I do think that design here matters, design of these programs, but also the design of government. The lack of social safety net really does impact the likelihood that economic incentivization is even going to have any good impacts, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Davia, this is Gary. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. That was an excellent presentation. I did have some questions on Christchurch. Out of the 180 deaths in that earthquake, 115 were in one building that was poorly designed. 40 of the additional casualties were in the central business district, which is primarily composed of unreinforced masonry buildings. You touched on structural integrity, but that structural vulnerability led to insurance cases that closed down the whole neighborhood for years while it was in litigation. So most of the people who were affected were business people as far as casualty goes, or people going to work in the central business district. So in terms of casualty, how do you think your model takes into account structural vulnerability that's more related to building codes and things of that nature?
So this was so interesting because I didn't go into this project thinking that I needed to think about that. And Japan and New Zealand really revealed to me that I might have needed to incorporate a structural variable. So there were a few models that don't make it into the book where I look at the extent of damage, and I use that as a variable in some of the models. They don't show up in the book, and I'm trying to think off the top of my head what I found, but I do know that significantly, like the extent of damage in the central business district actually did have a significant impact on new job accessions, which is to be expected, obviously, right? Like if we don't have buildings that people can work in, it's going to delay the amount of new jobs that are going to be developed first and foremost. So in both of those cases, that's what I found. But in terms of consistency between what I analyzed between all cases, I wanted to keep the things that I presented in the book consistent, which was to look at education, poverty, race, etc. So yes, absolutely an opportunity to do that in a second book, which maybe, we can work on.
I'm sorry, if I could also follow up. You had some scholars put prevention between mitigation and recovery. What's an example of prevention and how is it different from mitigation?
So I think that this is a strange one. And I just presented both of them because I think that the literature kind of is trying to move to this 5-stage model as opposed to a 4-stage model. I personally think that prevention and mitigation are similar things. I think that what might fall under prevention would be land evacuation policies that might be developed, right? And we saw some of that in New Zealand where they basically said, hey, this is a no-go region. We're not rebuilding here. And sort of, in a capitalistic society like the United States, we don't usually say that. Like there's the New Jersey example is the Blue Acres program where they tried to vacate a bunch of land in New Jersey. Did not work. It just didn't work well. And it's sort of one of those things where I think that that's what we mean by prevention is really just vacating land that's dangerous. In the United States, we don't do that.
Well, we do have the FEMA land buyback program, and it's been very successful in Shelby County here for our recent resiliency projects.
Oh, good.
Buying land in north of 240 in Fraser that's been repeatedly flooded. And those people actually made money. So maybe the buyback program is one of the best funded programs in the U.S. because people aren't taking advantage of it or don't want to be moved from their homes. Yeah. But thank you for the presentation. And I hope you can mention the project that you've got funded through the CORES group at the University of Memphis.
Yes, to kind of conclude, and I'll take a couple more questions if people want to hang on. But yeah, we are working together, actually, Gary and Arlene, or Dr. Hill and Dr. Patterson, we are working together to create an interdisciplinary disaster research course at the graduate level for students. So for those of you guys that are interested in the economic perspective, in the land use perspectives, in the policy perspectives, we are really hoping to have that ready to go into the curricular system in the spring, hopefully to be offered in the fall of 2022 or probably 2023, I would think. So I'm really excited about being able to bring this interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary framework into the university system. So, other questions?
Yeah, I got a quick question. Thank you for a very interesting talk. So I was just wondering, partially I'm a laboratory scientist, so I'm really taking great caution in controlling for boundary conditions and everything to isolate dominant variables and parameters. So you're dealing with a very complex system, and it was a little bit quick, so I didn't really absorb all of the information from your regression analysis and the correlation coefficients. But my main question is, how do you know that you're looking at the right variables, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there's something else fundamentally different that explains things and outcomes in recovery after disasters. Yeah, so is there any quantitative measure? Obviously, I would think, yeah, anyways, how do you know you're using the right variables to explain differences?
Yeah, so this was a difficult thing, right? Because there were really two strategies that you could use. You could look specifically at certain types of economic incentives and sort of try to classify those as things that you would hypothesize that would have a direct impact on new jobs creation. But I think one of the issues with a longer range study like this is that there are other events that are happening. So in some of the analyses that I did a fixed and or random effects to try to capture some of those extenuating variables that I could not capture in data. Because policy development it's qualitative, right? You have to think about coding here, but there's other things that might be occurring at the same time. I also, in other work, I looked at like political variables of the local government, whether it was governed by a Democrat versus a Republican, sort of looking at the political aspect of if that would impact economic development. And then of course you have firms that freely can move regardless of what they're going to do, right? I can't control that either. So my hope is that by using a structural equation and or a fixed effects model would try to capture some of those things that I can't operationalize. I don't think it's perfect, and after publishing the book, I thought a lot about if I could go back and redo this differently, there might be some other strategies that I would use, which would maybe look more at local government documentation on the number of firms that were developed, the number of new firms, and also the number of new accessions, because I think that economic development actually contains both of those things. And so maybe in the next book, I'll look at new firm development alongside new job development to see if those things play differently. And I do think that there's some contextual socioeconomic or political variables that just might not necessarily, they may not necessarily be available for me to input into a model. It's that error term, I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Other questions? Okay, well, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Hill.
I have one more question, if I can.
Sure.
From your studies, have you seen also how important is the way that the American cities are structured, that they usually present a lot of urbanistic and architectural barriers, and that's how one of the reasons they are very segregated, actually, something that we don't really have in Europe somehow. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, in average, more equally, everything is more equally distributed. Do you think that this is something you should or you take into account, that how the cities are constructed in the States?
So one thing that I should probably make a little bit clear, in the United States, what I did, the United States cases, so I did Louisiana 12 years after Hurricane Katrina, and then I did Hurricane Sandy, which looked at both even though I'm talking about cities, one of the things to note about the city of New Orleans is that it's coterminous with the parish of Orleans. So I looked at Orleans Parish because the city and the county are sort of essentially kind of one thing. And then I compared the new job ascensions in other parishes. So every single time that FEMA declares a disaster, they list the number of counties and or areas that are designated for funding. So I use that as my first stage of deciding who were the affected places and which ones were not. And I collected data at the county level in the United States. So that's a little bit different than what happened in Japan and what happened in New Zealand, because the structure of local government is different. So in New Zealand, we have regional territories and we have territorial governments. So we have the Canterbury region, and that's made up of 13 different regional councils. So I collected data from the regional councils, and there's really not any amalgamation of that in the United States. They're not cities. they're kind of counties, but they're sometimes kind of big. So it's like there's just not a good analog between the two. Same thing happens in Japan, where we have regional authorities, and then some of the cities that have a lot of population actually have a formal local government. So I think that another strategy could be looking maybe in an HLM model, like a hierarchical lineal model, to sort of embed the different levels of government. But I think your question had to do with like design features and spatial segregation that might exist.
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah,
we
so
have already this problem, so a disaster will make it worse.
Yeah, so spatial segregation, there are measures of that. I did not incorporate that in this particular book. But it's certainly something that I could do, because there are those we do have measures of spatial segregation in the United States that are fairly robust, that are connected to the census. That's a really good idea, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Okay.
So we're very fortunate that Davia is right here on campus, although Sue has moved to a new building. So don't just walk over to where you used to. It's the next building over now, right, Davia?
Yep, we're in Browning Hall.
Browning Hall. So we can continue these conversations forever. Yeah, we appreciate Davia's presentation and all of your great questions. So let's thank her. Friday.
Yeah, thank you guys. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Good talk.
Bye now.